Well, I'm sorry for the questionable lighting and the change of scenery. I'm on a trip right now, so all I can offer you is a Pottery Fiat 500. There's no Lego, I'm afraid. Anyway, on with the show. CEOs can bring so much to a company. Just one person can set a tone for what a company can achieve and hire the right people to make it happen. A brilliant CEO can take it to great heights, while a poor one can destroy it. Over more than a century of making cars, Citroën has had both types of leader, sometimes in the same person. They've survived Nazi occupation, bankruptcy twice, but the Citroën name has endured. It even spawned a spin-off brand, DS, named after one of Citroën's most innovative cars. Why did Citroën start producing cars in the first place? Why did they become such an innovative company? And are they still innovating? This is the Citroën story. Citroën was founded by André Citroën, and the Citroën name, literally lemon, comes from his great-grandfather, who was a citrus merchant in the Netherlands. André added the two dots over the E whilst at university because he just preferred how it sounded. He was always an engineer. In 1901, along with other partners, he founded a company that made gears with a special V-shaped chevron profile that would become the company's logo. The company was successful, and when the First World War began, it switched to making shells, producing up to 55,000 of them every day. After the war, companies needed to switch from making things that destroy to things that improve people's way of life. Although they were latecomers to the automobile boom, they felt it was the right move to make. After all, they had large production capacity, and any business they entered, of course, needed to be big enough to use all of that machinery. And it wasn't like André Citroën didn't know anything about automobile production in any case, because before the war he'd also been general manager of car company Moors and brought them back from financial ruin. André Citroën was enamoured by the success of Henry Ford and his Model T, with its simplicity and the production line process that churned out cheap runabouts. There was a real possibility that France would be overrun by thousands of Model Ts. After all, France hadn't produced any passenger cars for the last 4 years during the war, and their cars weren't as cheap to produce. Citroën's factories were converted to car production in just 4 months. Citroën absorbed the Moors car company and launched the Type A in 1919, Europe's first mass-produced car, and as such, half the cost of the cheapest car on the market. André Citroën had a knack for publicity, and the Type A was heavily publicised. Soon Citroën were producing 20,000 cars per year. As I said, André Citroën wanted to be the French Henry Ford, copying many of his production techniques that he'd seen firsthand at Ford's Detroit factory. That brought inexpensive vehicles through mass production, but also soul-crushing boredom to the workers, something André Citroën wanted to avoid. So his workers would have some of the best working conditions in Europe at the time. The Type A was replaced by the more powerful 1921 Type B2 and the smaller, even cheaper two-seat Type C in 1922. Citroën partnered with a finance company so people could buy and use Citroën on credit, a new idea at the time. And a master of publicity, Citroën emblazoned the Eiffel Tower with the name of his company, using it as the world's largest advertising hoarding. To André Citroën, this was an important structure. He'd seen it being built as a child and influenced him to choose engineering as a career. Appropriately, his cars were produced just 5 minutes away. Soon Citroën were exporting cars all over the world. The Type C ended production in 1926. It had sold well, over 80,000 in 4 years, but Citroën actually lost money on every car they produced. They just hadn't got the economics right. To reduce costs, the Type B2 morphed into the 1924 Type B10. Rather than a timber frame that had its origins in horse-drawn carriages, the car had all-steel construction, utilising pressed steel to make the car lighter and therefore faster and also cheaper to produce. Citroën's cars were running rings around competitors Renault and Peugeot. Initially, the all-steel body wasn't stiff enough and flexed unnervingly. That problem and the brakes were improved with the Type B12 that launched just a year later. The B12 would go on to be a big success. By 1928, Citroën were producing 400 cars a day, and the B12 alone made up 30% of all cars sold in France. By 1929, they were the second largest automobile company in the world, exporting almost half of their cars. Those cars were replaced in 1928 with the 4-cylinder C4 and 6-cylinder C6, cars with a grown-up American look. But all this growth and success had come by taking on a lot of debt. What's more, Citroëns were competing on price as there were better cars on the market. The 1929 Wall Street crash brought about a worldwide recession that brought a lot of financial stress to the company. Citroën recovered somewhat, and by 1931 it had expanded into taxi and delivery companies, all using their cars of course. The C4 and C6 were replaced by the 1932 Rosalie that used a variety of petrol engines and had the distinction of being the first passenger car to use a diesel engine. It was a move up market and an attempt to better compete with the competition, but the Rosalie couldn't pull the company out of its debt problems. Citroën attempted to lower wages but suffered industrial action. They also launched a series of trucks to boost income. Maybe a next generation car would change Citroën's financial woes. In the early 1930s, there was interest from companies such as Auto Union in front-wheel drive, and the 1934 Traction Avant, literally front traction, would be Citroën's attempt to capitalise on this movement. That, along with the rack and pinion steering, hydraulic brakes and independent suspension, made it modern. But what set the Traction Avant apart was its chassis, or lack thereof. Most cars at the time had a base chassis, now generally metal, with the outer parts then attached. The Traction Avant was different in that it was the first production car to switch to using a monocoque body, meaning the majority of the body was the chassis, a stressed member of the vehicle. This was harder to produce, but it reduced the amount of metal needed, making the car 70 kilos lighter and reducing materials, thus hopefully reducing its cost. The new construction made the car look completely different to other cars, like a low-slung sports car, and very different from the C4 and C6 from just 6 years earlier. The modern design gave it almost modern-sounding performance figures as well, with a top speed over 60 miles an hour and 28 miles per gallon fuel economy. There were worries again about the car's rigidity. After all, that problem had plagued Citroën's first all-steel cars, so an early crash test was proposed. But this was the early days of crash tests, so rather than the sort of things you see from Euro NCAP, the idea was to drive the car off a cliff and see what happened. Citroën spent big for this game-changing car to leapfrog the competition. The existing factory was demolished and one 4 times its size built in its place. The innovative aluminium transaxle was so advanced it was used to win the Formula One World Championship 24 years later, but it also required a new manufacturing facility, which again cost more money. André Citroën's vice was gambling. He won and lost large amounts of money, and this was another expensive gamble on Citroën's future. Go big or go home. But production delays stretched Citroën's finances to breaking point. It had always been a company that spent more than it made, and by the time of the Traction Avant's launch, Citroën was in serious trouble. They were forced into bankruptcy, being rescued by its major creditor, French tyre manufacturer Michelin. If car manufacturers had done well in the early 20th century, that was nothing compared to tyre manufacturers. They'd started by providing 2 tyres for the new safety bicycle in the 1890s, a boom period where every man and his dog had to have one. Now everyone wanted an automobile, and those used 4 larger and more expensive tyres. What's more, they were a consumable item, so tyre manufacturers like Michelin were printing money. All these financial problems took a heavy toll on André Citroën. Just after the Michelin deal was announced, he sold his shares and retired from the company that bore his name. A month later, he was admitted to hospital. 5 months later, he died from stomach cancer. Thankfully, the Traction Avant was a success, and Michelin's ability to balance the books put Citroën on a firmer financial ground. The company launched a van, the Tub, for traction utilitaire basse, or low utility traction. But But any additional work was interrupted by Germany's invasion of France. The Nazi war machine put Citroën's factories to work churning out vans for the war effort. Where Renault collaborated with the Nazis, Citroën found clever ways to subvert their efforts. Citroën's head, Pierre-Jules Boulanger, organised a go-slow and got workers to put the notch in the truck's dipstick in the wrong place, causing many engines to seize from a lack of oil. He was put on the Nazis' hit list to be arrested in the event of a British invasion. When that came, he escaped arrest and, while the Nazis were packing up Citroën's machinery on rail cars, he coordinated with the French resistance to relabel all rail cars, meaning the parts all ended up in the wrong parts of Europe. France after the Second World War was very much like France after the First World War, a country starved of vehicles with little disposable income and so in need of basic, cheap transportation. Citroën had the traction Avant, but it was expensive. It was a car designed to get Citroën out of its economic problems in the 1930s, not the 1940s. For now, that was the only car Citroën had and was allowed to produce due to the limited steel supply. Renault had been nationalised and most steel production given to them for the new 4CV, a new small car that was ready to go. Citroën was still producing the Tub van, but released a replacement in 1947, the Type H. Like the traction Avant, it used a monocoque body and also used corrugated steel to provide more stiffness at a low price. To get it on the road faster, it borrowed many parts from the traction Avant. Work on the Type H had begun in secret during the war. They also worked on a new small car they'd begun work on in the 1930s, the Citroën 2CV. I've done a full video on this car and many others I'm going to talk about, so I'll skip the details, but if you want to see the full story, see the links in the description. Suffice to say, a country starved of vehicles during the war and with very little money had a real need for an inexpensive car like the 2CV, just as they needed the Citroën Type A in 1919. The French government prevented 2CV production until 1948 because of the steel shortage, but once the 2CV went on sale, Citroën found that they had another hit on their hands. And for the next few years, this was Citroën's passenger car lineup, the 2CV and the traction Avant. The Avant might have been advanced for 1935, but by the 1950s it was overdue for a replacement. That came as the futuristic 1955 DS, and once the cheaper ID version arrived in 1957, the traction Avant ceased production. The DS was another popular car with many innovative features like magic carpet-like hydropneumatic suspension. Citroën's owner Michelin used the company as a testbed for new technology like the DS's low aerodynamic drag, its clever suspension, plus the equally innovative 2CV suspension and radial tyres. But if you saw cars Citroën produced in the 1960s, you'd be forgiven for thinking Citroën had given up on innovation. There was the Ami in 1961, a 2CV with a new body and some mechanical upgrades, and the 1967 Diane, which was another attempt to update the 2CV. Throughout the 1960s, though, Citroën had been quietly working in the background on 3 new projects. The first was a new family car, the GS, which launched in 1970. While some car manufacturers were only just waking up to the benefits of aerodynamics to make a car faster and less expensive to run, Citroën already had a big head start. The GS built on the DS's slippery shape, and it also got the DS's self-leveling hydropneumatic suspension. The second project was a large luxury car, the SM. Citroën purchased Maserati partly to get their V6 that was put in this very special car. It was a majestic tour de force that put many competitors to shame, with features like self-centering power steering that didn't transfer the jolt of potholes to the steering. It was just point and go. There was also rain-sensitive wipers and lightweight fiberglass wheels. The third project was the Wankel rotary engine. Rather than multiple cylinders and other complex parts, the rotary engine held the promise of being a much simpler design that could lead to a lighter engine that cost less to produce and had smoother performance. Citroën, NSU and Mazda led the way in development, and Citroën launched their revolutionary engine on the GS in 1973. They even worked on a version of this new engine for a helicopter. But where the GS sold well, the SM and the Wankel engine were big failures. The SM was all very clever, but it was just too damned expensive. Very few of them were produced. The rotary engine never lived up to the hype, the seals leaked, and Mazda was the only company that could get it working. It was also very thirsty. The 1973 fuel crisis hit sales of the V6-powered SM, meant the thirsty Wankel engine was dead in the water, even if it could be made reliable. But it had the benefit of boosting sales of the 26-year-old 2CV to record levels. There was even a waiting list. However, Citroën wasn't making money on the car. In fact, it wasn't making much money at all, being weighed down by the SM and the failed rotary engine and investments in Panhard, truck maker Berliet and Maserati. Citroën had funded development of the Maserati Bora, Merak and the Khamsin, all beautiful cars, but over the next 10 years, production of all three totaled less than 3,000 cars. A few years earlier, Michelin had spun Citroën off into its own company once again, so when Citroën's finances got to breaking point and they filed for bankruptcy a second time in 1974, it was at least a relief that it didn't bring down its parent company as well. Citroën had been working with Fiat since the late 1960s and they courted a buyout from the Italian carmaker. But the French government wanted Citroën to remain French, so staged a shotgun wedding with Peugeot, creating a joint company called PSA. The rotary engine SM and DS were dropped. Cars like the GS and the new CX helped Citroën's finances, but they needed a new small car. The Diane, the Ami and the ancient 2CV just weren't cutting it. So the Citroën LN launched in 1976, a Peugeot 104 with a few alterations, but that was all that could be done in such a short space of time to ensure Citroën's factories remained busy. The LN would lead to a 5-door Citroën Visa in 1978. Citroën's cars had always been a bit out there, radical and pushing new boundaries with self-leveling suspension that, with the right weight balance, could be driven on 3 wheels. Headlights saw around bends and it had a mushroom-like brake button instead of a pedal. Peugeot were quite the opposite, a conservative company that didn't rock the boat. And it was Peugeot in charge now and they wanted less of the crazy radical stuff. Some at Citroën knuckled under, others left. The results were seen in the first all-new Citroën in the PSA era, the 1982 Citroën BX. It still had self-leveling suspension, which was still pretty amazing to experience, and after 27 years was bulletproof reliable, but the driver controls shed many of those quirky elements. And to keep the development budget in check, the BX platform was shared with the Peugeot 405. There were still innovations though, like a turbocharged diesel engine that got the car to 60 in under 10 seconds. The BX was supposed to replace the GS, but that car lived on with an update as a GSA to get a little bit of extra life out of the production line. It also got a much needed hatchback, something Citroën had always resisted before bankruptcy. In those pre-PSA days, Citroën had also been trying to create a small car of their own, and this eventually surfaced as the Eastern European Altcit Club. It didn't sell well even when the Altcit Club was imported into France as the cut-price Citroën Axel. Both the Visa and the Axel were replaced by the AX in 1986, a car that wasn't meant to be unique to Citroën. It was supposed to double as a replacement for the Talbot Samba, but Talbot nosedived so badly in the 1980s that PSA axed it before the new Samba could appear. The AX was a very frugal car like the 2CV, but it didn't have the upturned prams character. The CX had sold well, so in 1989 we got its replacement, the XM. It still used hydropneumatic suspension and got an updated version of the SM's self-centering power steering, plus a solid range of engines. It was crowned European Car of the Year in 1990. To save development costs, the platform was also used for the Peugeot 605, but both cars didn't sell as well as its German rivals. French car buyers were becoming less nationalistic and looking to other European countries now that tariff borders had come down. It didn't help that the XM was a hatchback, cost 50% more than the outgoing CX and suffered from reliability problems at launch, a common Citroën problem that had haunted cars like the Traction Avant and the DS. The XM ended production in 2000, 5 years before its replacement, the C6, launched. The 1980s were all about small hatchbacks. Citroën had the AX, but it needed something larger to compete in the mass market. So the ZX appeared a little late in 1990. It was none of the old Citroën flair, just a solid small hatchback, which, if that was your thing, was a good car. But it was also more in Peugeot's image than Citroën's. There was no hydropneumatic suspension, but it still handled well. It was reworked as the 1997 Citroën Zara. In 1992, the BX got a replacement with the Xantia. Like the BX, it shared its platform with the Peugeot. Bertone styled a great shape, and the Xantia got an updated version of Citroën's hydropneumatic suspension. It was so good at keeping the car upright through corners that as of 2020, and maybe even now, the Xantia still holds the record speed through the Moose test manoeuvre, an amazing 53 miles an hour, beating out the Porsche 997. The ZX and the Xantia sold well and helped to offset the losses of the XM. The Renault Espace had done well as one of the first European minivans. Other car companies wanted to replicate it, but they felt that there wasn't a big enough market for each company to develop their own. So Volkswagen and Ford shared the development costs of the Charan and the Galaxy. PSA and Fiat did the same, producing a car that had many names. The Citroën version was called the Evasion on the continent and the Synergy in the UK. It was updated and renamed the Citroën C8 in 2002. Citroëns were now being exported to many more countries, including China, a large market that was growing fast. Cars like the 1992 Fukang were, at the start, little more than European cars produced in China with a Chinese car company, but eventually cars like the second generation C6 in 2016 will be produced exclusively in China. The AX was replaced by the Saxo in 1996, now sharing a platform with the Peugeot 106. This made economic sense, but it meant that Peugeot and Citroën cars were becoming very similar, and that Citroën flair was steadily disappearing. One place you would notice the Saxo was a Citroën was the switchgear, but not in a good way. Some of it had been reused from the older AX and made the car feel dated compared to the competition. European customers liked the idea of minivans, but they wanted a smaller car to fit down narrow lanes and to fit into small parking spots. So in the late 1990s, there was an explosion of small minivans, or MPVs as they were called. Citroën's version was the 1999 Zara Picasso, a brand new body shape on the existing Zara platform. It was designed by Donato Coco, who has more recently designed the Ferrari California, but to my eyes, the Zara Picasso is his greatest creation. The shape is so simple, yet so practical. The Picasso name was licensed from the famous painter's family, but not all of them were happy with just slapping his name willy-nilly on a car and attempted to sue to prevent it from happening. Citroën's cars in the 2000s were more of the same, Citroën working in lockstep with Peugeot to produce a range of cars and share the platforms. We got the C5, C8, C3, C2, C4, C1, C6, and of course, the C-Crosser. For some reason, that was the name of the car and not the C7, which was the working title. Maybe it was just to keep us on our toes. The C3 was another Donato Coco design, which was loosely styled on the classic 2CV. The C6 was a return to larger cars, replacing the XM after a 5-year hiatus, but the car sold very badly and led Citroën to retreat to the small and medium car market. In China, the number 4 is considered unlucky, so over there the C4 was renamed as a C Triumph. That hasn't stopped Audi from selling the A4 as the A4 though. The C6 sales might have bombed, but overall sales continued to grow as people warmed to the Citroën brand. In 2009, European sales topped 1 million. Citroën had a 16% market share in France, which was better than any year since it had gone bankrupt. The DS was by now a classic that had been put on a pedestal for its great technology and design. PSA decided to capitalise on this by creating a new DS brand under Citroën. It surprised, innovated and re-enchanted the everyday, or so claimed the DS website. The first model was the DS3, a car that was originally intended to be a three-door version of the second generation C3. The brand saw an initial boom with almost 120,000 annual sales, but although the range expanded, sales have tailed off. The Zara Picasso MPV was updated as the C4 Picasso and was joined with more crossovers, the smaller C3 Picasso and in 2012 the C4 Aircross. The range grew in China as they sold more cars there, but sales dropped off in Europe. Facing financial difficulties, PSA turned to GM, who bought a 7% stake in the company in 2012. They believed the path to stability was sharing platforms between the two companies, but just a year later, GM sold its stake and PSA was left scrabbling around for creditors to stay afloat. The Citroën brand was facing bankruptcy for a third time. Citroën's Chinese partner and the French government each took a 13% stake in the company to help PSA survive. Electric vehicles and hybrids were starting to become important, so PSA forged a partnership with BMW to share the development cost, a deal that unfortunately fell through. The GM deal would of course also have helped with this technology. GM had produced the plug-in hybrid Chevrolet Holden Volt that was sold as the Vauxhall Opel Ampera, but that deal of course had failed. This would delay PSA's ability to develop hybrid and electric drivetrains. But they would eventually appear. There was the fun limited edition 2016 e-Mehari, a car that called back to the 1968 Mehari, a simple off-roader based on the 2CV. Despite lower sales, cost-cutting and a cash injection put the company back in the black, and Citroën sales turned around in the second half of the 2010s. Not only that, PSA went on another buying spree. They couldn't work with GM on their hybrid drivetrains, but they bought Vauxhall and Opel from them in 2017, much to the surprise of the auto industry. The goal was once again platform sharing. A larger car company could reduce costs. They also tried to acquire Proton and Lotus, but were outbid by Chinese company Geely. At the end of 2019, PSA completed a deal to merge with Fiat Chrysler. The resulting company became known as Stellantis. Citroën were by now a very small cog in a very large machine. Their sales grew in Europe but crashed in China from a high of over 300,000 in 2014 to under 50,000 in 2019. So overall, Citroën's worldwide sales dropped. They fell even further in 2020 and by the end of 2023 hadn't recovered. Stellantis as a whole began to struggle to compete against low-cost Chinese EV competition. Citroën might have a generic range of cookie-cutter cars, but 2020 saw them try something new. The Citroën Ami, also sold as the Fiat Topolino, and the oddly named Opel Rox-E, launched just at the wrong time, February 2020, a month before the COVID lockdown. But that's a shame, as it's a competent two-person city car. Sorry, it's a quadricycle, a special vehicle class in France that means it can be driven by 14-year-olds. Now, I'm not sure how many 14-year-olds can afford €8,000 to buy one, but the Ami is finding a loyal fan base in many congested European cities. With competition increasing in its traditional European market, Citroën pushed into emerging markets with cars such as the 2024 Basalt, a compact crossover that was sold and manufactured in India and Latin America. Citroëns have always worn the double chevron to celebrate André Citroën's V-shaped gears, and over 100 years later, they still do. Citroën's glory years could be seen as the 1920s, when they were so far ahead of the competition, but many look to the 1940s and 50s when necessity became the mother of invention, and Citroën produced highly innovative yet inexpensive cars like the 2CV, and cars that ran rings around the competition like the DS and the SM. They had their successes, but after the war they never quite became mainstream. Citroën's cars have always had an oddity to them. After the merger with Peugeot, they shed this oddity slowly, but they also shed the innovation that kept customers flocking to the brand. The last time Citroën won European Car of the Year was decades ago in 1990 with the XM. The Ami might be a cute little city car, but it's no Type A, Traction Avant 2CV or DS. Those cars will always be Citroën's legacy and a very hard act to follow. There are links to a couple of my Citroën car videos on the right, and there are links to many more in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. I certainly learned a lot about Citroën's early history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.